From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien will look at the market fundamentals that drove grain prices still higher this past week, most notably the export demand for U.S. grains. Dan says that you producers can expect continued volatility in the markets well into the summer. Then K-State's Sarah Lancaster will discuss our recent cold temperatures and what impact those might have had on herbicide applications that have already been put down. She's asking growers in that situation to monitor the results of those applications to see if they've remained effective. And awaiting to get into the Kansas agricultural weather scene with us, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us once more. Remarkable times in the grain markets. We're going to talk about what's going on there and what that means to you producers and your marketing plans now with Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, and spending time just looking at the futures trades. Yesterday, a phenomenal day on all fronts, Dan.
Well, to just look at where we're at tells quite a story on the markets. May 21 corn closed yesterday at $6.50. In that contract, last fall at harvest, we were around $3.75 or so. So we've almost doubled that. Of course, factors that led to that had a lot to do with what's happened in China with their ongoing demand pull, and as that's come into the market, other users trying to make sure they have adequate supplies. It's really interesting to me to see that from that harvest number of 375, we got up to about 550 and spent a lot of time there, kind of a hesitancy to move beyond it. And now within the last bit of time here with ongoing demand, exports going pretty well, and again, demand pull, no fall off in the ethanol livestock feeding sectors here in our country. Here we've added basically $1 to that 550 area, and a lot of that's happened here in as we've got into April. So just interesting, and we can talk later about what that signals us, I guess, heading now into planting season. Planting season started, and as we kind of move through the stages of crop development here into planting, we'd hope by May 1 to May 15th, thereabouts for corn. And then moving into sorghum and soybeans, although we've heard about things being moved up even for those crops, when acreage uncertainty might work itself out for these crops. It just seems that for corn and for sorghum, that being the first crops out, if we get the crop in the ground and lots of moisture and everything looks good, well, then you'll still have uncertainty that will hold things up, probably would guess, given all that's happening now with supply and demand factors into June and on into July. But any risk to the crop just brings us pretty interesting volatility. And new crop futures closed yesterday for corn at 553.5. So when the front end month was at 550, we had remember the new crop bids were trailing by about 70-80 cents. Well, now the new crop futures bid is where the old crop one used to be before we had this run up of $1. The spread is now $1. And it was 70 between new and old. So interesting to see for sure.
Dan, it's worthwhile to ask who's buying the corn, and you've gone over the latest reports on that. What do they say?
Well, in terms of other countries involved that are buying, number one buyer with 10 million metric tons, and that's accumulated shipments with the outstanding sales of 13 some on top of that would be China. And then second most active country that's involved there would be Mexico, 8.8, but it's basically 8.9 million metric tons with 4.4 bought ahead. Japan coming in at 6.2 and a half. million metric ton shipments, 3.2 bought ahead, and a number of other countries that are pretty active. Colombia is surprisingly strong. Just a good number of other countries, Taiwan in there, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, all of these having a hand in basically wanting to secure supplies. So just very, very interesting. Some of that South America activity is probably due to worries about the second corn crop coming in Brazil, and the weather reports we see. And you and I were talking about this before our program, Eric. The USDA's international weather report, it says the headline is "Dry weather dominated large sections of Brazil," and that's this is prime time for that corn crop. If anything, heavy rains down in Argentina, and that can be good and bad depending on which crops are coming in and going out.
And the grain sorghum export story is virtually all China, you say?
95% plus China. And the shipments that happened 2 weeks ago, well, the week ending, it would have been April 8th. And then again this week are tremendous, especially the week of the 8th, 33-some million bushels, followed up this week with 10 million bushels. And we need a pace of about 4 or 5 to meet the USDA's projection. So we're even watching ahead into the next marketing years for corn and grain sorghum. And for corn, it's interesting that China has not been really active in purchasing into the next year, but who has been active primarily would be, Mexico for sure, and that followed by Japan. So it's just interesting to see who's buying this year and then who's buying next year. And on grain sorghum, the only country that's been out there active, and it's not in any small way, really, is China. And they've been buying into the next marketing year, too.
Talking wheat for a moment here, wheat futures experienced a fall-off back in March, but as per the latest action there's been a virtual full recovery from that drop. Yeah,
and the pattern was that in February we'd gotten up to about 660, and then much to the bemoaning of people with wheat to sell in Kansas and elsewhere, we dropped down basically $1 to about just above 550. And now with what's happened in the last 2 weeks, we've regained all of that back and closed yesterday at 667.5. So what's driving that? Well, there's wheat freeze issues in Europe. Big issue. You've got uncertainty, not so much of production, but just political stability over in between Ukraine and Russia. In the Black Sea region, troops massing on the border and all that. So that doesn't seem to be going anywhere yet. But, geopolitical issues are big, just as if China and Taiwan got into a scuffle. Well, that upsets the geopolitical balance and the flow of goods. So anyway, hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it doesn't. So anyway, you've got that. The actual shipments of wheat still continue this pattern of trailing behind what we need to actually meet the USDA's projection. And that's been an ongoing chronic issue. So we don't have bad wheat export numbers, but the actual pace of where we end up at, and instead of hitting USDA's target, you wonder, are we going to hit about 100 million bushels below that? So it's just kind of an oddity that's out there. I would say that, and maybe it's just a Kansas thing, but all that's going on in the feed grain markets, almost no grain sorghum heading into domestic feeding, not much. Corn scarce to get. We still wonder about wheat feeding. That'll have to happen out here in the Western Plains. And so in both wheat and in corn, you've got the market traders questioning whether the USDA's numbers are representing the tightness of ending stocks that the market seems to be behaving according to.
And $15 soybeans on the board this week. Who would have thunk it?
We didn't break $10 in the soybean market for the May contract anyway, May 21 contract, until basically September, October of last year. And since then we're up to $15.33 as a close yesterday. And pretty similar for the soybean market as it was for corn, in that we'd went from, again, basically in September around $10. By late December, early January, got up to about 14, and that's a tremendous price historically. Traded in a range about 13.50 to 14.50, and now within the last several days, jumped up above that range up to 15.32. And we're kind of balancing the end of our marketing year with what's coming out of Brazil hitting the market, and so our weekly pace is just so-so. But really nobody's anticipating that we won't hit the USDA's projection, which had been raised once or twice on the way there to 2.28 billion bushels. What's interesting to me is that we have buying already going on out into the next marketing year, and most of that, again, 2.8 million metric tons of that is China. So China's aggressive buyer of 35 million metric tons of this year actual shipments. And actually, when you look at where their outstanding sales are, the majority of them are out in the next marketing year. So what's that say for the soybean market? Well, it means that they're probably going to Brazil and Argentina right now, but they're anticipating when that's done that they'll have to come back here and they're already buying ahead to do it. So it doesn't look like buyers from China are looking to vacate the U.S. soybean market once we get out into the harvest time. 10% of the USDA's projection is already out there, and we're basically 19 weeks away from the start of that next market.
All of this going on, and we're barely, Dan, into the production season, just at the very start. So what does that suggest about the potential for volatile times in these trades moving right through the summer?
Well, as we talked about with the feed grains, any threat to these spring-planted crops, wheat also, but spring-planted crops especially, is going to have an exacerbated response. So you're at a time now when you come into delivery periods for these contracts that people can take long positions and demand delivery and force someone else to go scramble to find cash grain. So maybe right now in a time like this, it really probably behooves our folks to know when these delivery periods are and when people are being forced to buy grain to fill a contract. So it sounds like some of what's happening right now in these days with this big run-up is people getting ready for the delivery period to commence for the May contract and not wanting to be in position to have to go scramble and find cash grain someplace or to get title to it anyway to deliver it.
Thanks for the comments, Dan, and next week we'll get together once again.
Thanks, Eric.
He joins us each Friday to talk grain markets, does grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back on Agriculture Today.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now. Well, we've had quite the run of colder than normal weather of late around Kansas. Later on in the broadcast, we'll outline that further when Mary Knapp stops by. But the questions are now coming to our guest about how colder temperatures might be affecting the herbicide applications that have been going on of late on our crop fields. So we've invited Sarah Lancaster back by again, weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We've been visiting with her frequently. She has a lot of things on her plate right now and is sharing that information with us, including this, Sarah. Cold temperatures and the relationship to herbicide efficacy. Is there a tie-in?
Absolutely, Eric, there's a tie-in. In order for any herbicide to work, no matter what season of the year you're talking about, the plant has to be actively growing. And so obviously 23 degrees or whatever the low was here in Manhattan, that is not very conducive for active plant processes. And so that really can diminish the effectiveness of herbicide applications.
Well, you break this down in an e-update article that's coming out very shortly. The variables that are at work here, the type of herbicide makes a difference, right?
It sure does, Eric, particularly when we think about systemic herbicides. So when we think about burn-down herbicide applications, which is what a lot of folks are probably doing this time of year, two pretty common products in those applications are glyphosate or Roundup and 2,4-D. And those are two examples of herbicides that are what we call phloem mobile. And so that means those herbicides move through the plant with all of the carbohydrates and the sugars that the plant is making through photosynthesis. Okay, so if that plant is not actively carrying out photosynthesis and making those sugars, that transportation of those herbicides through the plant slows down. And so glyphosate and 2,4-D have to get distributed in the plant in order to be as effective as possible. And so applications that were made, I've talked to some folks actually just yesterday, applications that were made last week are really not looking like we'd like them to look, 7 to 10 days after herbicide application.
The function of those chemicals is not all that long. They have to be active within a reasonably short period of time, don't they?
So there's a little bit of research that says that it takes about 4 days for glyphosate to get where it's going to go. Obviously, glyphosate is one of the more well-studied products in this regard. And so if you have those really cold nighttime temperatures, anything that's going to slow down the activity of that plant within those first 4 days after application, you're probably going to be reducing the amount of that herbicide that gets to the point it needs to get in the plant.
Then there's the other type of herbicide common out there, the contact herbicide family. And how will they behave in cold temperatures?
So there are some theories that say that products like gramoxone will be less affected by cold temperatures because they don't have to move through the plant, right? So gramoxone is the classic example of a contact herbicide. It kills the cells that it comes in contact with. So, like I said, it's a theory. There's some data with Liberty, which is a similar contact herbicide, that says that temperature actually does matter. And they were trying to control wild radish in that data set, and temperatures that were 70 degrees or higher for daytime temperatures had much better control than applications that were made 60 degrees or below. So we kind of talk about the sort of the lower threshold for those temperatures to be 60-degree daytime temperatures and 40-degree nighttime temperatures. That's kind of what we say is the bare minimum. But even, in that temperature range between 60 and 75, Eric, you'll see a big difference, or potentially we'll see a big difference in control if you get those, 10 extra degrees in terms of your daytime temperature.
Well, we've been talking so far about product activity, but the weeds themselves and their state in cold weather, well, that would be a difference maker too?
Potentially, yeah. So, we think about plants that are more well adapted to warmer seasons are going to be more negatively affected by cooler temperatures. So, theoretically, that species could make a difference. We know that plant stress makes a difference. Again, going back to that theory that anything that slows down the functioning of that plant is going to reduce herbicide efficacy. One example would be mare's tail, right? Mare's tail is kind of a beast. If you let it get very big, it's very difficult to control. And so, going out with an application of dicamba on mare's tail last week, dicamba should be pretty effective on mare's tail that's pretty small. But, you would be much more likely to have a failure or at least poor control in those circumstances.
In these cases, then, producers simply need to wait for the weather to warm up to make a judgment call on just how well or not so well their treatments have performed with these colder conditions?
Herbicides, particularly these systemic products like glyphosate, 2,4-D, dicamba, they take a week to 2 weeks to work. And so you really don't know what they're going to do right away. The general recommendation is to wait for warmer weather to make those applications. Now, I have that luxury as a research weed scientist who farms 30 feet at a time. I know that your listeners don't have that luxury, and they have acres that they need to get covered, and 70% kill is better than 0% kill or not getting that crop in the ground in time. So, it's sort of like the story you're probably hearing with your guests talking about the condition of the wheat crop. Time will tell exactly what the outcome is going to be.
And another angle on this, could there, Sarah, be actual damage to the crop itself from these interruptions in normal herbicide performance?
Yeah, so, historically we would be thinking about corn being in the ground in mid to late April. And so that corn is not going to be metabolizing or processing those herbicides as well when it's cold, and especially if it's cold and wet. You could start to see some herbicide injury. Just something else to be on the lookout for. And again, as far as, predicting what you need to do about that after it's occurred, a lot of it depends, right? If you turn around and get good growing conditions, a lot of times that corn will go ahead and grow out of the injury that you see and still yield adequately. Crops are pretty amazing in terms of how resilient they really are, especially in the case of corn early in the growing season.
Well, this again falls into the bucket of get out there and see what's going on in your field, whether you've planted or not. You put down the burn down herbicide, for instance. See what's going on out there in the relative near term.
That's right. There's no replacement for boots on the ground, footprints in your field.
Now, while we had you here, wanted to mention something else that you're involved with, Sarah, along with students here at K-State, and you're actually seeking out producer feedback on their herbicide application practices. What's the gist of this?
So I've got a couple of students right now, Eric, that are looking at the influence of some application parameters on herbicide efficacy. And so we wanted to just, get an idea of what producers are actually, and applicators are actually using in the field for their spray volumes instead of kind of going by word of mouth or just making our best inferences. So we've got a survey out. The link is in the e-update that we're just asking folks to tell us a little bit about the application parameters that they use. Mm-hmm. So it's a completely anonymous survey. Takes 10 minutes or less to finish. You don't have to answer all the questions if you don't want to. We'll take the information you're willing to give us. But it'll be super helpful for my students in terms of putting their research in context. And also as we move forward thinking about conducting other experiments, right? We want to make our experiments as relevant for Kansas farmers as we can. And so answering that survey will help us do that.
And the parameters you're looking for, the technologies that producers are using for applications, the timing of their applications, what sorts of things? So
we've got questions about spray volume, boom height, your use of guidance technology or boom shutoff, things of that nature. Other things that we ask about ground speed. Those are the main things, Eric, I think. We ask folks to split them out in a couple of places into their pre-emergent applications versus their post-emergent applications. And we also have some questions on there. I'm trying to get at how farmers decide and how applicators decide which of those parameters they're going to use. So what is the decision-making process when selecting those parameters?
That information will help you and others come up with recommendations for other producers as far as their herbicide management then.
Absolutely, Eric. It will help us to develop recommendations that are based on research that's conducted using the application practices that are most relevant for Kansas farmers.
So if a producer out there is so inclined, how can they fill out this survey? Where do they go?
So the easiest thing to do is to look for links on the e-update. We've posted it out through social media. Or if someone is really interested in helping out an assistant professor here, they can always reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to send them the link to the survey.
And in fact, you mentioned the e-update. There is a brief article noting this in the Agronomy e-update newsletter for this past week, posted on the 16th of April. So go right to that. You'll find a link directly to the survey right there. So best of luck with that. And Sarah, thank you for coming over and passing along a few thoughts on the influence of our colder weather of late on our herbicide applications. We'll catch up again soon.
Thanks, Eric.
She's a weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Sarah Lancaster, and we'll return with more after these moments away. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Burning prairie grass is essential for Flint Hills ranchers. Following grazing and burning best practices can ensure that the prairie remains intact while not smoking out downwind neighbors. The Kansas Flint Hills Smoke Management Plan helps guide prescribed burning on prairie land. To learn more, visit www.ksfire.org. Again, that's www.ksfire.org.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. And welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you now, these courtesy in part of DTN. Well, with President Biden pledging yesterday to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade, roles continue to be carved out for biofuels for landowners and for farmers. Biofuel groups are feeling better after seeing the president's plan mention very low-carbon, new-generation renewable fuels to help achieve rapid emission reductions in both the auto fleet and in aviation. The USDA at the same time announced that $18.4 million will be allowed for 20 states to increase sales of higher biofuel blend volumes. After expressing fears that the president's infrastructure plan leaned too heavily on electric vehicles, biofuels groups said they were pleased that the administration included renewable fuels as part of its strategy to reduce carbon emissions by at least 50% by the end of the year 2030. The White House said the U.S. could reduce emissions by moving toward very low-carbon new-generation fuels. USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack, meanwhile, told reporters yesterday that biofuels will help reduce emissions on several levels. Beyond the renewable fuel standard, he said, for instance, the Department of Energy is setting a goal of using 36 billion gallons of bio-based fuels in aviation. Meantime, the Senate Agriculture Committee quickly advanced on a voice vote yesterday the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that bill that would create a certification program at the USDA to set standards and help producers qualify for a private carbon market program. Senator Debbie Stabenow, the chair of the committee, said the bill now has 42 co-sponsors evenly split between the two parties. The bill, if it passes, could be among the first bipartisan climate-related bills to move through Congress. The bill also helps reduce emissions from forest and agriculture and enhance carbon sinks, as mentioned in the president's emissions pledge. Dozens of agricultural groups are backing that bill. The Agriculture Secretary met with top agricultural officials from 9 other countries as part of that virtual Global Climate Summit. Here's a look from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Ag Secretary Tom Vilsack met with ag ministers from 9 different countries to discuss climate mitigation and adaptation strategies.
I will be directing questions to the 9 ministers, and they'll be responding in areas of what they are doing in terms of mitigation, adaptation, what they may be doing in relationship to drought, water utilization. It gives them an opportunity to showcase what they're doing in their particular country so we can learn from each other.
He said the forum is not designed for in-depth conversations.
Today's event is really designed just simply to showcase what's going on in some of these countries, to give them an opportunity to share.
At the same time, he stressed the importance of collaboration.
We in the U.S. are responsible for roughly 9% or so of our emissions. Worldwide, it's 14 to 15%. So we have something to learn, they have something to learn. And so the pledge here is to work collaboratively so that agriculture generally is moving in the right direction, in a forward direction.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And EPA Administrator Michael Regan told members of the House Appropriations Interior Environmental Subcommittee that on the issue of the waters of the U.S., or WOTUS rule, that he doesn't have any intention of going back to the original Obama waters of the U.S. verbatim, and he said that they don't necessarily agree with everything that was in the Trump administration's version as well. He says, quoting him, "We learned lessons from both. We've seen complexities in both, and we've determined that both rules did not necessarily listen to the will of the people." He said that he and USDA Secretary Vilsack are, in his words, attached at the hip on the issue, and Reagan said he has had discussions with agriculture company officials about WOTUS since he's been at EPA. Sales of Kansas-produced wheat to international buyers have been going impressively well of late, according to the latest trade numbers, and the neighboring country to the south is credited with the lion's share of that business. Marcia Boswell has the details on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas farmers have a good reason to say gracias for continued wheat purchasing by their closest market, Mexico. Mexico dominated imports of U.S. hard red winter wheat in March 2021, according to the latest data available from the USDA. As the top importer for the month, Mexico purchased nearly 6.39 million bushels, compared to no markets above the 3.6 million bushel threshold in February. Thanks to duty-free access established by the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and solidified by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, Kansas elevators and Mexican flour mills have a highly interconnected supply chain. Combined with market development work by the Kansas Wheat Commission and U.S. Wheat Associates, Mexico remains one of the largest destinations for Kansas hard red winter wheat each year. According to Aaron Harries, Kansas Wheat Vice President of Research and Operations, our key customers in Mexico know they can rely on Kansas wheat farmers to produce consistent quality year in and year out. Maintaining trust with these top buyers requires continually sharing information on our wheat crop and providing technical support, information, and expertise they do not receive from our competitors. Overall, the U.S. exported 19.7 million bushels of hard red winter wheat in March, bringing the year-to-date total to more than 267 million bushels. While last month's exports are more than 25% higher than the previous month, they lag nearly 36% behind March of 2020. Mexico represented the lion's share of these exports, but 13 countries in all imported hard red winter wheat in March, up from only 9 in February. Nigeria remained the second largest importer for the month at 3.43 million bushels. Japan rounded out the top 3 importers at 1.87 million bushels. USDA, in its monthly World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, or WASDE report, projected the U.S. will export 985 million bushels of wheat this marketing year. 10 months into the year, the U.S. has exported 77% of that total, slightly behind the pace needed to hit the marketing year-end goal. Kansas farmers can follow the exports of hard red winter wheat through a pair of reports from U.S. Wheat Associates. U.S. Wheat provides both a weekly report on commercial sales and a visual rundown of the organization's analysis of the WASDE report, along with many other online resources. Harries said both of these reports are important aspects of wheat trade to understand, as both can have an impact on the wheat market through futures and basis movements. The Kansas Wheat Commission is a member of U.S. Wheat Associates, which combines funding from 19 state wheat commissions and cost-share grants from the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And K-State's Mary Knapp awaits to cover Kansas agricultural weather with us next on Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
For you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly get-together with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp to glance at Kansas agricultural weather, and it's been another eventful week in the state. Mary, colder conditions, that snow at midweek, it's typical spring in Kansas, isn't it?
It certainly has been an interesting spring week in Kansas. With the snow, it was a heavy, wet snow. We were very fortunate that there was not a lot of wind with that snow, so we didn't have as much damage to trees and power lines as we could easily have seen. Our heaviest snowfall was 7.5 inches at Collier, Kansas, but there were widespread areas where they had 3 and 4 inches of that. The snow was probably a little bit more welcome in the northwest corner of the state, where it provided some insulation to the winter wheat that isn't quite as far along as other parts of the state. You get into the southern areas, particularly in southeastern, we've got wheat that's already jointed, some of it that's getting close to the boot stage, and that cold weather is of concern in those areas. We had low temperatures down as cold as 17 degrees. That was out in western Kansas, but even in the east we had temperatures below freezing and for several hours. So again, that's something that producers will be watching.
And we should plug in that your colleague, Romulo Lalato of Agronomy, has put together an article on the likely impacts on winter wheat from this week's weather in the E-Update posted yesterday. Have a look at that, producers. Soil temperatures must be following suit, aren't they?
They have, but not nearly so dramatically as you might have been concerned We did drop down into the upper 30s, again in northwestern Kansas, where soil temperatures hadn't been quite as warm, and also where the air temperatures have been considerably colder. But again, it's in the upper 30s still in that area. In the central and eastern parts of the state, we're looking at the weekly average temperatures in the upper 40s, which is a little bit cold if you've got corn in the ground, but it certainly didn't freeze the soils, which is also welcome.
And we should mention as well that another colleague, Ignacio Ciampiti, has comments on the impact of the cold on that planted corn in that same e-update posting yesterday. Have a look at that. But the moisture for this past week, you're calling it near normal for the state, Mary.
Right. Statewide, the average precip was 59/100ths of an inch, which is 97% of normal. So that's really close to what you would expect for a week in mid-April. The southern areas didn't fare quite as well. Southwest only averaged 24/100ths of an inch, which is 64% of normal, and South Central 4/10ths of an inch, which is 67% of normal. The other area that was less than 3/4 of what we would normally expect was the Northeast, where we averaged 55/100ths of an inch, and that's 74% of normal. The Northwest West Central fell right on normal, but the winners in the rain sweepstakes were actually North Central and Central Kansas. North Central was the wettest. It averaged 83/100ths of an inch, and that was almost 1.5 times what they would normally expect for the week. So, again, fairly welcome moisture, even in the areas where it was not quite as abundant as we would have wished.
We must bear in mind, like you're saying, there still are droughty areas in this state.
Yes, there are still areas with moderate to severe drought in the west. And with that low percentage of normal in the southwest, we did see some expansion of the abnormally dry conditions and the moderate drought. And that's not unexpected. They've been, again, another week without having their typical moisture, and it's really hard to avoid deepening that drought situation, even with the cooler temperatures.
Well, let's, on that, then turn to the latest outlook. For the week ahead, there are more storms lining up, which may bring relief to those drier areas?
Well, at this point, it's kind of hard to say where that moisture will fall. The quantitative precip forecast has the heaviest moisture in the southeast and east central parts of the state, but we do have a chance across the state. One of the problems with it is that we're looking at a severe weather outbreak as a potential, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to tell exactly where the heaviest rains might occur.
That's roughly Tuesday, Wednesday.
At this point, they're looking at it somewhere in that midweek period, Tuesday into Wednesday. And again, it behooves everyone to keep an eye on that because it will be one of our first major severe weather outbreaks of the season. We've had really cold temperatures, but as we go into next week, we're looking for highs in the 80s, and that will provide plenty of energy to fuel any of those severe storms that might come along.
With that warm-up, is that to say that we're past the chances for cold weather threats to our crops?
Not necessarily. When we look at the 8 to 10 day outlook, there is a bullseye of colder than normal temperatures in the forecast for most of Kansas. The question will be just how cold does that colder than normal get? Of course, as we end April and move into May, our average temperatures are continuing to rise, so a high in the 60s may be cooler than normal, but not necessarily damaging to any of the vegetation that's out there now.
But the worry is on the other end of the spectrum, whether we'll dip below freezing again.
Right, and as we move, as that winter week gets more advanced, we're into the boot and heading stage, it's going to be much more vulnerable to cold damage, and it wouldn't take much of a freeze to create quite a bit of havoc with a wheat crop that actually looks like it has a fair potential going into May.
And speaking of which, no change in the May outlook?
No, the May outlook is still the same, which is favoring warmer than normal temperatures across the state, and we're going to be sandwiched between an area of wetter than normal to our east and drier than normal to our southwest. So it'll be interesting to see how Kansas plays out, and that we're looking at a slight chance for drier conditions to continue in the southwest and a slight chance for wetter conditions to prevail in the northeast, and everywhere in between is equally likely. So we'll see how that plays out.
Mary, we'll talk more about the weather next Friday. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension, along with us, and thanks to you likewise for tuning in. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.